On a chilly winter night at the end of the 20th century, a young soldier in military uniform stood by a California highway, trying to hitch a ride. As time passed, an old car slowly approached. The driver was Randy Steven Kraft, who sat behind the wheel with an imperceptible smile on the corner of his mouth. His gaze through the windshield was fixed on the young soldier, waving his hand incessantly. He knew that tonight he had found his prey. After the car slowly pulled over and stopped, the soldier got into the vehicle. Unbeknownst to him, he had stepped into a hell from which there was no turning back. Initially, the atmosphere inside the car was relatively calm, with the two occasionally chatting about various topics, until, after he drank the alcohol handed to him by Randy, everything turned strange. Sensing the changes in his body, the soldier realized something was amiss. His voice trembled as he tried to say something, but before he could utter a word, his body became heavy and his consciousness gradually blurred. He attempted to struggle, but it was too late, as Randy's hands had already tightly clasped around his neck. When night fell again, another silent specter haunted that highway, yet the Freeway killer's murders were still going on. This story began on March 19, 1945, when Randy was born in Long Beach, California. His family led a simple life. His father worked at an aircraft factory, and due to the great financial pressure, his mother also took on several part-time jobs to help support the family. Although he did not have much parental companionship, Randy was doted on by his three older sisters, even though he was just a tag-along little brother. In 1948, they moved to Orange County. Their house was originally a small wooden building designated for female Army soldiers, which was later converted into a 3-bedroom house. It was here that Randy attended the local elementary school. In order to help him integrate and to offer her assistance, his mother joined the Parent-Teacher Association and became a member of it. During his adolescence, Randy developed a strong interest in politics. He became a staunch Republican, aspiring to be a U.S. Senator. Shortly after entering Westminster High School, Randy was regarded by those around him as a pleasant and intelligent student who often achieved A-level grades. Occasionally, he would go on dates with girls, but some classmates and teachers at that time suspected that Randy was homosexual. Later, Randy said that he had known he was gay since high school, but initially kept his sexual orientation a secret. On June 13, 1963, Randy graduated. That fall, he entered Claremont Men's College in Claremont, California. Shortly after enrollment, Randy joined the Reserve Officers Training Corps and regularly attended demonstrations in support of the Vietnam War. He also participated in the campaign rally for Republican presidential candidate Barry Goldwater in 1964. He later claimed that these actions were just an imitation of his parents' political views, rather than his own. In the same year, Randy began his first known homosexual relationship. He worked as a bartender at a Garden Grove cocktail lounge that catered to gay clients. He also frequently went to Laguna Beach and Huntington Beach to have casual sex with some men. During those days, Randy tried to reveal his sexual orientation to his parents. He often brought a series of male friends to meet his family. However, Randy's parents and sisters turned a blind eye to his homosexual identity. In 1966, Randy solicited a prostitute in Huntington Beach, who turned out to be an undercover police officer. He was arrested and charged with lewd conduct. However, since he had no prior criminal record, no charges were filed. The following year, Randy's political beliefs underwent a fundamental shift. He became a supporter of liberal views and registered as a Democrat. Soon after, he became an organizer for the Democratic Party, tirelessly campaigning for Robert Kennedy's election and even receiving a personal letter from the senator thanking him for his efforts. By his senior year, Randy had become a lackadaisical student. He indulged in alcohol and drugs and often gambled and played poker with other students all night long. Due to his lack of study in his final year, Randy failed to graduate from Claremont College in June 1967. He was forced to retake a course in econometrics, which delayed his graduation by 8 months. It was not until February 1968 that Randy finally graduated from Claremont Men's College with a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics. 4 months after graduation, Randy joined the U.S. Air Force. He was sent to Texas for basic training and then stationed at Edwards Air Force Base in Southern California. His job was to supervise the painting of test aircraft. During his service, Randy was promoted to the rank of first pilot. In the same year, he came out as gay to his family. In a letter to a friend, he described his father's furious reaction. Although his mother was more understanding, she still seemed somewhat disapproving. Eventually, Randy's family accepted his sexual orientation. He believed that he still maintained close contact with his parents and 3 sisters, but his siblings pointed out that after he revealed his sexual orientation to them, he began to distance himself from his family. Randy also disclosed his sexual orientation to his superiors. and then he was discharged after only 13 months of service. His discharge was officially listed as being for medical reasons. In response, he sought legal advice from a lawyer to question the reasons for his discharge, but to no avail. After being discharged from the military, Randy moved back to his parents' home and found a job as a bartender. In March 1970, Randy met a 13-year-old boy named Joseph Alwyn Fancher in Huntington Beach. The boy told Randy that he had run away from home and had nowhere to live, so Randy invited the young man to his apartment. He promised Fancher that he could live with him and even offered to arrange sexual encounters with a woman he claimed to know. Fancher agreed and accompanied Randy to his apartment in Belmont Shore. There, Fancher was drugged, beaten, and sexually assaulted multiple times. Several hours later, after Randy left for work, Fancher managed to flee the apartment. A passerby, shocked by his drugged and disheveled state, called an ambulance. At the hospital, Fancher told the police that Randy had drugged and beaten him. Due to shame and fear that no one would believe him, he did not disclose to his parents or the police that he had been sexually assaulted. With the cooperation of Randy's roommate, the police searched the apartment. However, since Fancher confessed to the police that he had voluntarily taken the pills offered to him and the police had conducted the search without a warrant, no charges were filed against Randy. In 1971, Randy met Jeff Graves, a student from Minnesota who was 4 years his junior, and began a relationship with him. During the period from 1971 to 1983, Randy was suspected of murdering as many as 67 people, almost all of whom were men aged around 13 to 35. The majority of the victims were members of the Marine Corps. This was because Randy was a homosexual, and his motives for committing these crimes were closely related to sexual abuse and sexual gratification, so he tended to target young, physically strong males. The reason why Randy was able to successfully murder some men who were stronger than him was that he never engaged in direct confrontation with them. He usually first used alcohol or other drugs to leave the victims completely defenseless. According to forensic identification, the remains of most of the victims contained high concentrations of alcohol and sedatives, which meant that they had lost consciousness long before they were abused and killed. His modus operandi was typically to look for young, strong hitchhikers on the highway, then offer them alcohol or water laced with sedatives. When they fell into a deep sleep, he would tie them up and then torture and sexually abuse them, burning their chests, faces, and genitals with fire. His final method of execution was also extremely horrific. He would castrate, strangle, or dismember them. And finally, he would dump their remains beside the highway or take them back to his home. On October 5, 1971, the naked body of a 30-year-old man named Wayne Joseph Duquette was found near Ortega Highway. He was a bartender at The Stable, a gay bar in nearby Sunset Beach. He was last seen on September 20th. Because his body was completely decomposed, the forensic doctor could not detect any signs of injury. So initially, his cause of death was listed as acute alcohol poisoning due to high blood alcohol content. However, in Randy's diary, the word stable was written. So investigators believe that Wayne was his first victim. 15 months later, a 20-year-old Marine named Edward Daniel Moore was murdered. He was last seen leaving the military camp on December 24, 1972. In the early morning of 2 days later, his body was found beside the highway. The autopsy showed that his wrists and ankles had been tied up, and then his face had been struck by the murderer with a blunt object. There were also large areas of abrasions on his body, which meant that he had been pushed out of a moving vehicle. This was strange, as it suggested that there was another accomplice at the crime scene. However, to this day, the other accomplice has not been identified, and this has also been the source of much debate. On April 14th, the body of 17-year-old Kevin Clark Bailey was found beside a road in Huntington Beach. Before his death, he had been castrated and anally raped. On July 28th, 2 victims were murdered. An unidentified young man, whose dismembered body was found in Wilmington on April 22nd, and a 20-year-old man named Ronnie Jean Vibe, whose strangled body was dumped beside the ramp of the 405 freeway on July 30th, 2 days after he went missing. A 23-year-old bisexual art student named Vincent Cruz Mestas. On December 29th, his body was found in the San Bernardino Mountains. Like the previous several victims, the murderer's methods were extremely brutal, and Mestas' missing hands have still not been found to this day. In November 1974, police found 5 more victims beside major roads in Southern California, 3 of whom were confirmed to be related to the same murderer, as their causes of death were almost identical. 20-year-old Malcolm Eugene Little and 19-year-old James Dale Reeves had foreign objects inserted into their remains, and the body of 18-year-old Marine Roger Edward Dickerson had bite marks, which were very similar to those of the previous several victims. On January 3, 1975, a 17-year-old high school student named John William Laris was murdered. He was last seen boarding a bus in Long Beach. The day after his disappearance, his body was found dumped in Sunset Beach. The cause of his death was strangulation, and foreign objects had been forcibly inserted into his body. There were clear drag marks at the initial discovery site of the corpse, indicating that the perpetrator was not alone but accompanied by another person. 2 weeks after this murder, on January 17th, the body of a 21-year-old man named Craig Jonatis was found discarded in a parking lot, and the cause of death was also strangulation. By January 1975, a total of 14 victims were suspected by the police to be connected to the same killer. Their remains had been discovered discarded in 4 different counties over the past 3 years. All the victims were white males with similar physical characteristics. On January 24th, homicide investigators from multiple jurisdictions in Southern California gathered in Orange County to discuss the progress of their manhunt for the unidentified killer. The FBI presented a profile of the murderer to the investigators, describing him as a methodical and organized lust killer with above-average intelligence who showed indifference to the interests and welfare of society. Some investigators also believed that the murders were not the work of a single individual but involved one or more people with a military background. This was because residue of tissues was found in the nostrils of 2 victims, a procedure commonly used by the military to prevent post-mortem washing of remains. At this point, the investigators still did not have any concrete suspects. On the evening of March 29th, 2 young men, Keith Crotwell and Kent May, got into a stranger's Ford Mustang in a Long Beach parking lot. They drove around aimlessly in the Belmont Shore and Seal Beach areas, with the driver even giving them beer. May later recalled that he felt very nervous when he noticed his body becoming rigid after consuming alcohol. When the car pulled into a parking lot, the driver leaned over, opened the passenger door, pushed the unconscious May onto the ground, and then sped away from the scene. People present noticed Crotwell sitting in the passenger seat, his head resting against the driver. On May 8th, Crotwell's skull was found on a pier near the Long Beach Pier, and the rest of his body was discovered 6 months later. Upon hearing of Crotwell's death, May and 2 of Crotwell's friends were shocked. They immediately suspected that the driver from that time was the killer, a patron who frequently visited a gay bar in Belmont Shore. They searched the nearby community for the Ford Mustang and found the vehicle within a 1-mile radius, noting down its license plate number and passing the information on to the police. After an investigation, the authorities identified Randy as a suspect, as the car was registered in his name. On May 19th, the police called Randy to question him about Crotwell's kidnapping and murder. Initially, Randy denied having ever seen Crotwell and May, which puzzled the police, as witnesses had already confirmed the encounter and the vehicle had been located. Consequently, they summoned Randy to the police station for further interrogation. Once in the interrogation room, Randy admitted that around March 29th, he had met the 2 young men in a Long Beach parking lot and persuaded them to drink alcohol and take sedatives while driving. He then dropped May off at the parking lot but continued to wander around with Crotwell. They subsequently drove down a side road, but the car broke down, so he parked it on the side of the road. Crotwell chose to stay in the car while he walked to a gas station to call for a tow truck. When he returned, Crotwell had vanished. Randy's roommate corroborated his account, as Randy had called him that day to say his car was stranded on the side of the road. However, the investigators still did not believe Randy's story. In the following week, 2 detectives attempted to file murder charges against Randy, but the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office refused, citing the coroner's conclusion from the autopsy of the remains found so far that Crotwell had died of accidental drowning. On December 31st, a 22-year-old boy named Mark Hall was kidnapped in San Juan Capistrano. His death was the most agonizing among all the victims. His body was tied to a tree, and he suffered from being anally raped and castrated. In addition, his chest, scrotum, nose, eyes, and cheeks were burned, and there were many wounds on his legs caused by broken bottles. Most importantly, the forensic doctor was able to determine that he was still alive for most of the time he was being tortured. In 1976, Randy ended his relationship with Graves. Shortly after, he began a relationship with a 19-year-old bakery apprentice named Jeff Seelig, and then they moved to Laguna Hills. Although neither of them was inclined towards monogamy, they considered their relationship to be permanent. Seelig later told investigators that he and Randy would often ask hitchhikers for sex, and if they were willing, they would go back to their apartment with Seelig and Randy. On December 10, 1976, 19-year-old Paul Joseph Fuchs went missing. His body was never found, but his name was clearly recorded in Randy's diary. He was last seen outside a gay bar called Ripples in Long Beach, where Randy was a regular customer. On January 3, 1978, investigators held another meeting. They believed that there was more than one killer, but the identity of the perpetrator still could not be confirmed. July of the previous year was an important turning point. Fortunately, Patrick Kearney was arrested, and he confessed to the murders of 28 boys and young men, many of whom were dissected and discarded in garbage bags beside highways in Southern California. Unfortunately, although Patrick was arrested, his method of murder was completely different from that of some other victims, which meant that the perpetrator that the investigators were still pursuing remained at large. On April 16th, an 18-year-old Marine named Scott Michael Hughes was kidnapped. His body contained a large amount of sedatives, and the cause of his death was manual strangulation. Since a shoelace was missing from his shoes, investigators suspected that he was strangled with a shoelace. In addition to him, 5 other victims were murdered in the same way that year. On June 16, 1979, a new victim was found again. A 20-year-old Marine named Donnie Harold Kreisel was thrown onto the highway from a moving vehicle. His death was listed as acute alcohol poisoning, although he had very severe burns and signs of being tied up and tortured. On August 29th, the dismembered body of a 21-year-old British tourist named Keith Anthony Jackson was found in 2 garbage bags and a cardboard box behind a Union 76 gas station in Long Beach. 2 weeks later, the body of 19-year-old Gregory Wallace Jolly was discovered, with his head, legs, and genitals severed. On November 24th, a 15-year-old boy named Jeffrey Sayre from Santa Ana was kidnapped and murdered. He was last seen at a bus stop in Westminster after returning home from a date with his girlfriend. On February 18, 1980, the decapitated body of a 19-year-old Marine named Mark Allen Marsh was found near the Temescal Highway. He was last seen hitchhiking to Buena Park. In the summer of 1980, Randy went on a long business trip to Oregon. During this trip, he stayed in a small town near Portland. Before he returned to California, several victims were found in the area. The first victim was a 17-year-old Denver youth named Michael Sean O'Fallon, who had been hitchhiking alone across the United States and Canada. On July 17th, he was murdered, and his body was dumped 10 miles south of Salem. His body contained high concentrations of alcohol and sedatives. On September 3rd, the body of 19-year-old Marine Robert Loggins, who was tied up, was found in a garbage bag near the El Toro Marine Corps Air Station. He was last seen near the Pacific Coast Highway on August 23rd. Photos and negatives found by investigators showed Loggins in Randy's living room, sitting on the sofa in neat clothes, looking drunk, and his body was posed in various nude erotic positions in the photos. On April 10, 1981, a 17-year-old youth named Michael Crook was kidnapped while hitchhiking from Kent, Washington to Bakersfield, California. His body was found beside Interstate 5 near Goshen, Oregon. The autopsy report showed that his head had suffered 31 blunt force strikes, and after death, his body was subjected to anal rape and severe beating. At the time of this murder, Randy was sent to Oregon by his employer, and coincidentally, Randy was receiving treatment for a foot contusion at a nearby hospital on the day the body was found. 4 months later, the body of 17-year-old sex worker Christopher Allen Williams, who was dressed in tattered clothes, was found in the San Bernardino Mountains. His body contained phenobarbital and benzodiazepines, and when found, tissues were deep in his nostrils. The cause of death was suffocation by his own mucus. On July 29th, after residents of Echo Park complained about a foul smell coming from the direction of the Hollywood Freeway, an employee found the decomposing body of 14-year-old Raymond Davis from Pittsburgh, California, dumped beside the ramp. His body was hidden under leaves and soil. He was last seen in Echo Park on June 17th, looking for his missing dog. The young man's wrists were tied behind his back, almost the same as the way the victims died 2 years ago. Just 40 feet away from his body, the same employee also found the body of 16-year-old Robert Avila, who had been missing since July 21st, and his body also showed obvious signs of decomposition. On November 1st, 24-year-old Arne Mikkel Lane from Modesto went missing. He was hitchhiking to Orange County to look for a job, and his body was not found until 2 years later. On December 3rd, a 29-year-old man named Anthony Jose Severa went missing while hitchhiking to Medford. His body was found 2 weeks later. Before the murder, he was strangled, anally raped, and violated with foreign objects. At that time, Randy was on a business trip in Oregon and happened to end his trip on the same day Severa died. On December 4th, Randy drove from Portland to Seattle to visit friends, and someone happened to see him wearing a military jacket with Severa's name on it. The next day, Randy left Seattle and flew to Michigan. 2 days later, Randy met Dennis Alt and Christopher Schoenborn at a seminar in the Amway Grand Plaza Hotel. At midnight, someone also saw Randy talking with the couple in the hotel's reception area. A few days later, their remains were found in an open area near the hotel. Both victims were given alcohol and sedatives before being anally raped and murdered, and they were arranged in sexually suggestive poses. 24-year-old Alt died of suffocation, and 20-year-old Schoenborn was strangled with a belt. The day before these two victims were found, on December 8th, Randy traveled from Michigan to Portland. Within 24 hours of his return to Oregon, a 19-year-old hitchhiker named Lance Taggs was killed. Lance was last seen hitchhiking from Tigard to a relative's home in Los Angeles on the same day, and his body was found the next day, dumped on a rural road in Clackamas County. At this point, investigators noticed that in the murders that occurred in Oregon, when the remains of young men were found dumped near public transportation, their blood contained alcohol and drugs. They speculated that the murderer lived in another state, so the Oregon investigators relayed the details of the murders to police in other states, described the modus operandi of the killer they were looking for, and asked police departments with unsolved young male murder cases with similar characteristics in their files to provide feedback. The counties in Southern California responded quickly because they found that the killing pattern of this unidentified murderer was the same as the one they were pursuing, so they determined that these murders were all committed by the same killer. On January 27, 1983, a 21-year-old hitchhiker named Eric Church was kidnapped and murdered. He was last seen hitchhiking from Orange County to Sacramento the day before he was murdered. The autopsy concluded that he had consumed a large amount of alcohol and sedatives, and he was anally raped. The rope marks on his wrists indicated that he had resisted before his death. He died of ligature strangulation and multiple blunt force strikes to the side of the skull. On February 12th, 18-year-old Jeffrey Allen Nelson and 20-year-old Roger James DeVoe were murdered. The two young men were last seen outside a friend named Bryce Wilson's house shortly after midnight, when they told Wilson they were going to buy something to eat. Nelson's body was found beside a ramp near the Garden Grove Freeway just a few hours after he and Roger were last seen. The next day, Roger's body was found, dumped on a hillside near Baldy Mountain in San Bernardino County. At 1:10 a.m. on May 14th, two California Highway Patrol officers observed a Toyota making an illegal lane change on an interstate highway in Orange County. Suspecting the driver of driving under the influence, they signaled for the vehicle to stop. The driver then slowed down, parked the car, and exited the vehicle, discarding a beer bottle on the sidewalk. The officers administered a field sobriety test, which the driver failed, leading to Randy's arrest for driving while intoxicated. Meanwhile, another officer approached the vehicle and noticed a young man slumped in the passenger seat with his eyes closed. Several empty Muscled Head beer bottles and an opened bottle of lorazepam tablets were scattered around his feet. The officer attempted to wake the man but received no response. When he tried to rouse him by shaking his arm, he noticed the man's low body temperature. As he prepared to check for a pulse, he observed that the man was already dead, with clear ligature marks on his neck. The man's jeans were unzipped, exposing his genitals, and his hands were bound with a shoelace, bearing wrist injuries. He was later identified as 25-year-old Marine Corps Air Station El Toro-based Marine Terry Lee Gambrill, who had been strangled. Randy was then arrested. He was initially charged with driving under the influence, with further charges pending the investigators' subsequent inquiries. In the car's back seat, investigators discovered a belt, as well as alcohol, sedatives, various prescription drugs, and stimulants. There were also significant blood stains on the car's leather seats and carpeting. Under the carpet, they found an envelope containing more than 50 photographs of young men in pornographic poses, either asleep or deceased. In the trunk, they also found a diary with a list of 61 coded symbols. Subsequently, investigators conducted a further search of Randy's home, where they found clothing and personal items belonging to many of the young men murdered over the past decade. They also deciphered the symbols, which were believed to refer to each of Randy's victims, such as the initials of their names or the locations where the victims were last seen. On May 16th, Randy was formally charged with murder. In September, investigators interviewed over 700 witnesses and collected more than 250 pieces of physical evidence, which implicated him in 15 additional homicides committed between December 1972 and February 1983. On September 8th, Randy was formally charged with 15 counts of murder, as well as 2 counts of sodomy and 1 count of castration. On September 26, 1988, Randy's trial began in Orange County, where he was prosecuted by the judge. During the trial, nearly 160 witnesses were called to testify on behalf of the prosecution, and over 1,000 pieces of evidence were introduced. These included physical evidence such as bloodstains, hair, and fiber evidence found in Randy's Long Beach residence and his vehicle, fingerprints discovered on glass shards at the crime scenes, and photographs and negatives of the victims found in Randy's car. Other evidence presented included work and travel records, as well as gas receipts that placed Randy at specific locations where the victims were kidnapped or discarded, along with a large number of personal items belonging to the various murder victims. Randy's defense primarily consisted of extraneous statements and alternative suspects. His attorneys argued that most of the evidence was circumstantial and attempted to portray Randy as an articulate, diligent, and upright member of the community. They did not deny that the 16 individuals were victims, but claimed that they were victims of someone else, not Randy. The defense also pointed out that investigators initially believed several of the 16 victims were killed by 2 other serial killers and argued that there was no concrete evidence proving Randy had killed any of the victims. The trial lasted a total of 13 months. On April 29, 1989, the closing arguments began, which lasted for 3 days. The prosecution again listed all the physical evidence and circumstantial evidence pointing to Randy's guilt. The defense argued about the circumstantial case presented by the prosecution, namely that all the murders were connected, and accused the prosecution of covering up the truth. Then the jury deliberated for 11 days before reaching a verdict. On May 12th, Randy was convicted of 16 counts of murder, 1 count of sodomy, and 1 count of castration. On June 5th, the same jury reconvened for the penalty phase of the trial, where they needed to hear further testimony from both the prosecution and the defense regarding Randy's punishment. This phase of the trial lasted until August. It was during this time that the prosecution presented evidence of several additional murders committed by Randy in Oregon and Michigan, and they were convinced that Randy was also responsible for these crimes. The defense refuted the prosecution's claims, calling them highly speculative and not based on reality. They also introduced testimony related to a PET scan conducted on Randy, claiming that the scan showed abnormalities in his frontal lobe, which reduced his ability to control his emotions and impulses. The prosecution dismissed this testimony, telling the jury that there was nothing wrong with Randy's mind. He simply enjoyed killing for sexual gratification. They added that the fact that his family and friends found it hard to believe he had committed any murders only showed what a good salesman he was. On August 11th, the jury handed down a death sentence. 3 months later, on November 29th, the judge formally sentenced Randy to death, saying, "To have something like this take place in our society, I think I've sent 8 or 9 individuals to their death in my courtroom before. I can take all those aggravating circumstances in those other cases and they don't match Mr. Kraft's record. I just can't comment. If anyone ever deserved the death penalty, he's got it coming." On August 9th, 2000, the California Supreme Court upheld the original verdict. As of 2025, Randy remains in the death row cell at San Quentin State Prison, and he continues to deny responsibility for any of the murders he was convicted of or suspected of committing.